If you've been studying using GTO Wizard AI, you'll be well versed in how to figure out what your defense strategy should be against the optimal bet size for a specific spot. But what happens when your opponent uses a bet size which isn't optimal, or in fact is a significant mistake? If you've been pondering this question, this video is for you. We're going to deal with two main types of scenarios here in this video, and I've split the second one up into multiple categories to make it easier to understand. The first one is when our opponent bets small in a spot where they're supposed to bet big. The second category is when they bet big in a small bet spot, and I've split that one up because there are multiple different ways that we're going to respond in these cases. We're going to look at range bet boards or some fairly straightforward unpaired boards. Then we're going to look at paired boards and monotone boards, because there are some different principles that are in play in each of these spots. The first thing to be aware of in these situations is that it's rarely going to be a significant mistake for someone to use a small size instead of a bigger one, especially on the flop. The main reason for this is fairly simple. It's relatively easy to make up for it on later streets by using bigger sizes and constructing turn and river ranges slightly differently. However, the same is not true in the inverse. If a player bets too large on an earlier street, it's very difficult to compensate for this on later streets, simply because you can't make the pot smaller once it's already inflated. So as a result of all this, our adjustment to our opponent's sizing too small on the flop will almost always be less significant and a little bit less complex than the adjustment if they bet too big. With this in mind, let's start with an example of a spot where our opponent is supposed to bet big and see what happens to our response if they decide to size down. I've chosen an MTT spot where our opponent opens in the hijack with the range that you can see here, and we defend in the big blind with this range here at 100 big blinds effective. We're not going to incorporate ICM for now, just to keep it a little bit simpler and explain the basic principles. And the flop is going to be 9-6 deuce rainbow. You can see we do end up with a tiny bit of donk betting from the big blind here, so I'm just going to get rid of that to make things a little more straightforward. And I'm also going to change the bet size from a 114% 3E size to a much more well-rounded 100% of pot size. Not a substantial EV difference there at all. And you can see that this is a very reasonable strategy for this board. The solver likes allowing the overpairs here in the pre-flop raising range to really pile in a lot of money on a board like this before the board potentially gets a little bit worse. And of course, there's a lot of good bluff candidates here as well. So not really too complex of a strategy in this particular spot. But let's take a look at our response. Our response against this 100% pot size is to use a 33% raise size, a small raise size in this case, and to raise with a range that's built around essentially our 2-pair plus being our value range. But of course, not all of that is raising here. We are mixing and making sure that we protect our calling range as well. And then our good hands are going to be raising at some frequency too. We've got some 9x that's raising for a little bit of value there. We've got some overpairs as well. And we've also got a little bit of some middle strength stuff, some weak 9x, some pocket 8s, pocket 7s for a little bit of equity denial plus future bluffing power potentially. So some slightly mergy kind of raises there. And our bluffs, our more outright bluffs here, as you can see, are coming from a lot of the straight draw regions like this. Some of the overcards plus backdoors up here, a little bit of some nut backdoors there, and some low straight draws over here as well. So fairly diverse bluffing range, but nothing really too outlandish, really mostly composing of straight draws and hands that have some kind of backdoor equity at a minimum. And the sizing being very small is a reflection of the fact that we are up against a very polarized betting range. We're up against a betting range that contains hands that have a pretty easy continue and a pretty easy fold. So if you look at Villain's response against our raise, they are doing a fair amount of re-raising because they can put some of our value hands in a tough spot. But there aren't that many hands that are ambiguous between call and fold. There's a lot of hands which have a very easy fold in this area, and there's a lot of hands that have obviously a very easy continue, a lot of the stuff in this area, and of course anything that has any decent pair there. So fairly straightforward strategy for our opponent as well. And in particular, the main thing to note here is that we're not able to raise that much here because of how strong the in-position players' overpairs are, and the fact that we don't really have that many strong hands ourselves. We don't have a lot of the 2 pairs here. We only have 9-6 off. We don't have 9 deuce off or 6 deuce off. So ultimately, we don't get to do that much raising. But what's going to happen if we decrease this bet size? Pause the video for a second and have a think about what you think is going to happen if we change the bet size from 100% pot down to 25% of pot here. All right, so I hope you came to some conclusions there. We're now going to rerun the sim with a 25% size and see what options are preferred by our response here. You can see immediately villain is basically range betting. There's only a tiny bit of checking here, not really anything significant. And we're now raising a lot more often. Massive increase in our raising frequency, and in particular, a widening up of our value range. A lot of these 2 pairs and sets are now pure raising. We don't have to protect our check calling range as much. It's really only 9-6 and 9 deuce that are being used to protect that check call. We're much more concerned with getting value with the top end of our range. Then with the good hands, we're more inclined to prioritize value with a lot of our 9x here. We're mixing some of the offsuit stuff, but the suited stuff is heavily favoring raise. We're raising a lot of the 9x with a weak kicker as well to get denial against those overcards. And we're actually mixing in a lot of 6x and a good amount of deuce x as well for a little bit of denial and some future street fold equity. So really a very diverse raising range in this case, even just from the value side. From the bluff side, we can see that if we highlight the weak hands and trash hands, a lot of the weak straight draws are now very high frequency raises. 8-5, 7-5 become high frequency, 8-7, 10-8 and 10-7. A lot of the overcard backdoor combos over here, even some of the backdoors with an 8. And then even some offsuit 8x and 7x backdoors in this territory as well. So a much more diverse range of bluffs, a range of bluffs that is including some very weak hands, hands as weak as ace-5 off that really don't have a lot of backdoor equity, just a weak backdoor straight draw plus ace high here. Hands like that now have some ability to check raise. So the decrease in flop sizing has meant that we're no longer up against as polarized of a range, and that allows us to both raise thinner for value and raise a more diverse range of bluffs. And on top of that, we're also targeting a different portion of our opponent's range. We're barely even targeting the overcard offsuit hands now. We're still using a small size, but even these hands are not actually going to be folding that much against this size. In fact, we're really just targeting the very, very bottom of villain's range. All this stuff over here that's mixing folds. This is the folding range, and it's really just the very, very bottom here and some of this stuff over here as well. So there's not a lot of stuff that's actually folding. We're only getting a fold 19% of the time, but that's why we're able to raise a wider value range and a more diverse range of bluffs. So to summarize this first section, if villain bets too small on a big bet board, we're now up against a less polarized betting range. This means we can raise wider for value, including a lot of top pairs, even some middle pairs, and with a much more diverse range of bluffs, including even some hands that have very weak backdoors. Our raise sizing is usually going to be aimed at targeting villain's weakest overcard hands and the very bottom of their range in general, so it's quite often going to be a small raise size, like 33% of pot, something of that nature. These are going to be very applicable for situations where it's a low card board and both players have a lot of overcards, and being able to get denial against those overcards that might be c-betting is very powerful and very important. So this is a good guide to what we're doing when villain sizes down in a spot where they're supposed to size up. So our second spot that we're going to look at here is a situation where the formation is the same, hijack big blind, 100 big blind MTT ranges, and the flop is ace-7-3 rainbow this time. And this is a range bet board for villain. Given the sizing structure that I have here in the AI, we've got a 20% size approximately for this board, and it's a complete range bet, so nothing to worry about there. Our response is a little bit more polar. Our value range for raising here is going to be essentially most of our 2-pair plus, and then a lot of our strongest ace-x hands up in this area over here. we're also going to have a little bit in the way of some good hands here. You can see that the 7x that is going to need some denial is going to be raising quite a bit here, which is also quite interesting. Then we've got the weak hands and the trash hands, and you can see the bluffing region is really coming from a lot of these low straight draw type hands and a little bit of some stuff that wraps around the 7. So fairly straightforward construction, pretty similar to what we would expect in a lot of range bet situations. And it's going to be interesting to see what we're changing when the sizing goes from this 20% size up to, let's say, a full pot size. So let's make that change. All right, so changing to a full pot size has forced Villain to bet much less often, less than half of their range now. Of course, they're betting a much more polar strategy. And in this case, it's decreased our raising frequency quite substantially. And you can also see that what's now happened is no longer are we able to easily raise with a lot of our 2-pair plus, because some of that 2-pair plus needs to be protecting this check calling range. Against a more polar flop betting range, we're going to face more aggression on later streets, so we have to be a little bit more protected with our check calls. And on top of that, it's a lot harder for us to check raise hands like ace queen, ace jack, ace 10 for value, because you can see the ace jacks and the ace 10s are no longer even in the best hands category. They don't have as much equity against this polarized range as they previously did. In the good hands category, we still have a tiny bit of 7x, but not really very much. Only a little bit with some backdoor straight draws and tiny bit of some equity denial here, tiny bit of ace-x as well, but really not very much of that. In fact, we're actually starting to fold some 7x now, instead of being inclined to never fold it and sometimes raise it. So big change in how we're playing our 7x there. Then we've got the weak hands and trash hands. And once again, we're picking a lot of the bottom end straight draw hands that are unblocking a lot of the bet fold hands. But you can see that a lot of these are now mixing between raise, call, and fold. And in fact, we're not really ever picking any kind of other backdoor hands. We're picking the occasional bottom pair, like 8-3 suited, 5-3 suited, stuff in that region. But we really aren't ever picking any of these backdoors over here. And we're actually just purely folding a lot of this stuff up here that otherwise would have had reasonably decent equity against one of those small bets. So we're folding significantly more often, and our raising range now is still very polar. It's constructed in a way where we're now going small again, so we're targeting basically the bluffs. We're really only going to be able to target the weakest portion of the c-bet range. You can see the stuff that's folding here is basically, once again, the weak backdoors as it was before, except now we are actually just forced to do a lot more folding on top of that. So not a very easy strategy to pin down, but really the principle here is just folding more often, continuing to raise with a polar range, but being much more selective with our bluffs, and being very selective with the hands that we check call as well. Our second spot here is going to be a paired board, which in this case is 8-8-3 rainbow, and it's the same formation, same ranges as before. As you can see here, it's once again a spot where the small sizing is preferred. However, it's not a range bet in this case. The reason being that we in the big blind have a lot of 8x, and these boards where the pair happens to be a 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, something in that area, those are going to be less easy for the pre-flop raiser to just range bet. So we're not seeing a board necessarily where Villain is able to just bet everything. As a result of that, we're going with a little bit more of a polar check raise strategy here, but it's a high frequency check raise. You can see a lot of this on paired boards in a lot of spots, and it really comes down to our value range being a lot wider now. We have tons and tons of 8x hands, any of which can raise here. So we're mixing raises with basically all of them. We also have the ability to raise for value and denial, even with some 3x, as you can see here, and a lot of our medium strong overpairs, which have the ability to get called by worse and get a bit of equity denial. So once again, we have the ability to raise fairly often, considering that it's a paired board and our opponent has a lot of weak hands. And then with the bluffs, we're going to be very polar here, because as you can see, with there not being any draws on board, a lot of our bluffs are being taken from hands like this 7x region to 9x. So everything here that kind of wraps around the 8. We've got some offsuit stuff here as well. We've got 9-7 off. We've got some low cards as well that have some backdoor straight draws and things like that. And even some random king highs over here with king 4, king 5, etc. So a very wide range of bluffs here, still pretty diverse, except because there aren't really any draws, we're just mostly focused on a lot of backdoors and a lot of hands that have the maximum unblocking potential against the hands that are folding. And we're targeting a lot of these strong overcards in this case. Villain has no incentive to play a re-raise strategy here, which is very helpful for us. Villain basically plays call or fold. You can see we're now targeting a lot of these offsuit hands and some of the weakest suited hands as well. So in order to target those, we have to use this slightly larger raise size here. And this is pretty common on a lot of these paired boards. So again, let's now see what happens if we bump up Villain's bet size to 100% pot. Well, first of all, it's much, much harder for Villain to bet this flop. And they're a lot more polar when they do. They're only really able to bet for value with 8x. And even that, they don't have much offsuit 8x at all, except for ace-8 off specifically. The overpairs are actually forced to check a lot. As you can see, aces through 10s here is checking at high frequencies. So really, they're betting a polar range that is an 8 or a bluff in a lot of cases. What that means is that when we're faced with that strategy, we now have a crazy-looking response. And what it comes down to is our range being pretty cleanly divided between hands that are strong enough that they either have a pretty big incentive to get additional value or to deny equity, which is going to be all of our 8x, which of course wants to get value, or our good hands, which are a lot of our 3x, a lot of our pocket pairs, all of which have some incentive to deny some equity now for a cheap price. So all those hands want to raise at a pretty decent frequency. And then we've got a lot of very weak hands, which in this case really are at the bottom of the barrel here. We've got some 9-7s and some 7-6s that are raising at some frequency, but there's very, very little of it in this case. And there's a key dynamic that's influencing this here. It's the fact that on this board where equities are already a little bit more polarized because both players have hands that have trips and then hands that have very little in the way of equity, very little draws, things like that. So this is a natural product of what happens on these paired boards where equities are a little bit more polarized. There are trips hands available, there are a lot of air hands available, but there aren't very many middle hands, there aren't very many draws. So most of the time, hands are fairly cleanly divided here between the ones which have trivial folds, the ones which have no incentive to really continue at all, and then the ones which are strong enough and have enough blocking power that they get to win the pot at a high frequency when they raise. Something like a 3 here, really any kind of a 3, is going to have enough blocking power, enough equity, enough playability that it's going to have a lot of incentive to raise because of how narrow that value bet range is here from the in-position player. It's only really a lot of this 8x stuff. When we have a 3, we block pocket 3s. We're unblocking all the bluffs. We're unblocking all the stuff that we can deny equity to and get some thin value from. So our range starts to alter, and instead of playing a more polar strategy, we're playing a much more linear strategy, which you can see represented over here. I like to use these bars as a gauge of how linear our strategy is. And you can see because it goes from one corner to the other here, from best hands down to trash hands, it's a fairly linear strategy. A more polar strategy would be a V shape here, where we are raising more with weak and trash hands and a little bit more with best hands and good hands. But in the middle, we've got that lower frequency of raising there. That would be a more polar strategy. But we don't really have that in this case. We've got a much more linear approach. So this is the second type of spot that we're going to see, and it's very applicable in these paired board situations. So our final spot here is going to be a monotone flop. And in this case, we've got, once again, same formation, same situation, except a king 8-3 all hearts flop. Now, in this case, the solver actually wants to use a 40% size here with about 70% of the pre-flop raises range. When I ran this sim earlier, it wanted the 20%. So it seems like there's a very small borderline between the two sizings here in terms of overall EV. But we're going with the 40%, and you can see that it's a fairly high betting frequency, but there are a lot of hands that play a heavy check here as well. A lot of this 9-8 type stuff, a lot of like pocket 7s with no heart. Hands like that are heavily favoring checking here. So our response against this 40% is going to be that we do have some raises, but it's a pretty low frequency. it's only about 6%, only 45 combos of hands. And the construction here is really built around flushes being the value hands and some sets. And outside of that, it's really difficult to find very many good raises. We have some Ace of Hearts X type hands, which are actually strong enough to count as good hands here. Our weak hands region is really a lot of the other single heart hands and a little bit of some 8X with a weak kicker just for blocking power, and some 3X as well here with no heart. And you can see our trash hands are just purely folding here. Everything that is very, very weak doesn't even have any reason to bluff here at all. It just has a pure fold against this 40% size. So with the raises that we do have, we're using this 67% size, and we're targeting regions like these weak hands, like a king with no heart, so a weak top pair that doesn't have a heart draw, targeting stuff like a random heart like Queen of Hearts 10, things like that that are continuing, or Queen X 10 of Hearts, which are mixing calls and folds. So there is a lot for us to target here, but it's a pretty complex spot on monotone boards here, and as you can see, we really don't have very much raising in this spot. But what happens if our opponent's size is up? Well, let's change the size once again up to that 100% size and see what we see. So this is villain's strategy for the 100% size. It's a much more polar size, as you can imagine, and their value range for this bet here is going to be built around some specific flushes. As you can see, a lot of nut flushes, a lot of stuff in that area. We've also got 8s, we've got 3s, we've got some stuff like King 10 with a heart, we've got some aces, kings, things like that. But really, the strong stuff and the pure value in that range is going to be the flushes and the very strong sets. Then we've also got some odd sort of semi-value mergey kind of hands like deuces with a heart. We've got some king, queen, no heart. We've got a lot of these offsuit combos here that have one heart, so some strong single heart hands. Definitely a little bit of a tricky spot because of the presence of a heart versus not a heart being very, very important to the strategies. But if we look at our response, it starts to look really interesting. Here's what it looks like. There's almost no raising now. In fact, it would be completely reasonable to eliminate raising altogether from our strategy, because there's really no individual combo of hands anywhere that actually prefers to purely raise. There's some combos like Queen Jack of Hearts, which are now high frequency raise, but even those are mixing calls. Queen 9 of Hearts, Jack 9 of Hearts, still mixing. 8-3 with bottom 2, it's kind of 50-50, pocket 3s, doing some raising, but overall, we really don't have to include any raises here at all. And if you look at our response in terms of which hands are continuing and which hands are not, you can see that obviously we're never going to be folding top pair plus. That's a very clear threshold here that we're not going to go beyond. But when we look at the underpairs, jacks, 10s, 9s, it's half of them that are calling. Second pair, it's less than half, right? So in the end, what's going to matter the most is having a heart in our hand. If we look at including a heart here, our folding frequency goes down to 38%. We're only folding the weakest hearts. We're only folding the 6 and below, things in this area, maybe the jack 10. We're folding some of these types of hands, this weaker stuff as well, obviously. We are folding some hearts that are not particularly strong, but if we exclude a heart here, our folding frequency is at 77%. So everything that doesn't have a heart is basically always folding unless it specifically has top pair. Even something like ace 8 with no heart is mixing folds. Queen 8 mixing folds. So it actually becomes very, very simple here for us. If we have a heart, if we have a decent heart, continue. If we have any other type of strong top pair, even without a heart, we're continuing. But second pair, no heart, something like 9-8, no heart, pure fold. Very straightforward spot, in fact. So the nature of these monotone boards is that we're still using this small raise size because, there really isn't much we can target. We can only really target the very bottom of our opponent's range. But the key thing now is that we really don't have to do any raising at all. Our raising range is extremely narrow, doesn't really have to exist because everything that's in there is only really mixing at small frequencies. There's nothing that heavily favors the raise here except for a couple of combos of flushes. And it's really, really difficult to balance this kind of a strategy. So overall, I would say we don't really need to include a raising range here at all. So to summarize where we're at now, for this category of spots, if our opponent bets too big, then that's going to mean we're up against a more polarized betting range than what we usually would be. That's going to lead to us folding a lot more very naturally. But our raising range is going to depend on the board texture. On a lot of those range bet boards, we're going to be very polar with our raising range because we're facing a polar range, and in order to reopen the betting against that polar range, our value range has to be very, very narrow. But because these are normally range bet boards, these are pretty favorable boards for our opponent to bet, it's going to really depend a little bit on exactly what types of hands they're betting. So clearly, it's probably not very likely that they're going to continue range betting and just use a big size. So that might complicate things a little bit there. The second category is the paired boards, where our raising range is going to become much more linear, because generally those boards are going to mean that we either have enough to continue by raising or we don't have enough to continue at all. And that's going to mean we end up with this small raise size at a high frequency. And then we also have the monotone boards, where our raising range is basically non-existent. We really don't have to have much of a raising range there at all against a big size, because the big size is a substantial mistake there, and we get to play a fairly straightforward strategy where if we don't have top pair or a decent heart in our hand or a decent flush card in our hand, we just fold. So there's a couple of different responses here. Definitely a bit tricky to get your head around, but the main dynamic that we're keeping in mind is that we're up against a more polar range, and therefore our response and how we construct our raises has to be very different, because we're only able to now target the very weakest hands in our opponent's range in most cases. And that's going to mean that quite often we just have to use that small raise size. So that's a very good thing to keep in mind. So that's it for this video. If you'd like to continue studying, take a look at a recent video I put out about Ace-5 suited and why it's known as the solver hand. You can see that video right here. If you have any questions about this video, feel free to reach out to me on Discord. I'll be happy to talk about it on there. Until next time, I'm Matt Hunt. Thanks again, Wizards, and good luck at the tables.